His name was Albert Speer, Adolf Hitler's architect, minister, confidant, and, by his own later claim, his conscience. A quiet man in a neat suit with a gentle voice. No shouting, no violence, no crude displays of power. Yet this man stood at the center of one of the most evil regimes in human history. To the world, he seemed different from the other Nazi leaders. He wasn't a soldier or a screaming fanatic. Instead, he was refined, intelligent, and even, perhaps, charming. However, that charm and that calm demeanor made him all the more dangerous. Albert Speer built the physical stage on which Hitler's madness played out. He designed the cities, stadiums, and monuments, and kept Germany's war machine functioning long after defeat was inevitable. He used slave labor, ignored suffering, and, in the end, managed to walk free. After the war, he told the world he was sorry. He claimed that he didn't know the full extent of the horrors that had been committed. He said he was just a man doing his job, and for years many believed him. For years he was known as the good Nazi. However, history and the evidence at hand will tell a very different story. Welcome to Wars of the World. Albert Speer was born on March 19, 1905, in Mannheim, southwest Germany. He was the middle child of 3 sons, raised in a wealthy family. His father and grandfather were respected architects, and his mother, Louisa, came from a privileged background and expected her children to behave with decorum and precision. Life in the Speer household was quiet, ordered, and formal. Emotions were discouraged, and achievements were expected. Albert would later remark that he could not recall ever being hugged by his parents, and he grew up surrounded by drawing instruments, blueprints, and models of buildings. For him, architecture was not just a profession, it was integral to his identity. By the 1920s, Germany was scarred both physically and emotionally by the aftermath of the First World War. The Treaty of Versailles had humiliated the nation, stripping it of land, money, and pride. Inflation had soared to such an extent that wages that could buy a loaf of bread in the morning could not do so by the afternoon. But despite this chaos, Albert Speer seemed largely untouched. He lived comfortably, skied in the Alps, and he studied mathematics and design. While studying at universities in Munich and later in Berlin, he became a student of Heinrich Tessenow, one of Germany's leading architects, known for his simple and elegant designs. Tessenow was not just a teacher, he was also a mentor, believing that architecture should be honest, characterized by clear lines, no waste, and no arrogance. Albert admired him deeply, and for a time shared his vision of beauty as something pure and timeless. At this point in his life, Albert was apolitical. His diary entries reflected only his lectures, technical drawings, and a mild anxiety about advancing his career. However, Germany was undergoing significant changes, and by the late 1920s, unemployment was on the rise, and protests were filling the streets. The government seemed weak, and new posters had appeared on walls featuring a strange red and black symbol, promising that Germany will rise again. The Nazi Party was still small in 1930, perceived by many as simply a gang of loud and angry men. Albert Speer was initially not drawn into that world. He found politics to be messy and vulgar. But everything changed one night in December 1930, when a university colleague invited him to a meeting of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, these being the Nazis, and their guest speaker, Adolf Hitler. The meeting took place in a crowded beer hall in Berlin, where Hitler spoke for 2 hours without notes or hesitation. He addressed themes of betrayal, the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany's lost pride, and the need for unity and renewal. Speer was moved by this speech, and later wrote, quote, "It was the first political speech that really moved me. I felt that I belonged." He walked home that night in a daze, and in that moment his direction in life had changed forever. He joined the Nazi Party in 1931, viewing it as harmless at the time, and even fashionable among certain students. He did not think of hatred or of war. Instead, he thought of order, purpose, and belonging. Thus began a pivotal chapter in Albert Speer's life, one that would forever alter his career and his conscience. The year was now 1931. Germany was in ruins, a nation divided between the political left and right, engulfed in hunger and fear. Hitler's Nazi Party was on the rise, exploiting the widespread anger found in every beer hall and street corner. To most people, Hitler was a curiosity, an outsider loudly challenging the establishment. But to Albert Speer, however, he was something entirely different. Speer had joined the Nazi Party that year, almost on a whim, to assist a friend. He paid his small membership fee and attended a few local meetings. But it wasn't until early 1932 that fate and his own ambition brought him face to face with Adolf Hitler. That spring, one of Speer's former professors asked him to help renovate the Berlin headquarters of the Nazi Party. The task was straightforward: redecorating a few rooms, improving the lighting, and reorganizing the furniture. The man overseeing the project was Karl Hanke, a party organizer who recognized Speer's professionalism. The work went smoothly, and within months, Hanke reached out once again, this time seeking Speer's assistance with a more significant project: the design of a stage for a major rally in Berlin, where Hitler himself was scheduled to speak. Speer accepted the challenge, unaware that this job would change the course of his life forever. When Hitler entered the hall that night and observed the clean lines, symmetry, and carefully placed banners, he turned to Hanke and asked, "Who designed this?" Hanke informed him that it was Albert Speer. The following day, Speer received an invitation to meet the future Führer. He later would describe the experience as surreal. He entered a plain office, and Hitler rose from his chair to greet him, offering a warm smile and a handshake. There was none of the anger or the shouting that Speer had witnessed in public. Instead, the Führer was calm, curious, and almost shy. They talked about architecture, discussing ancient Rome, the beauty of neoclassical design, and the significance of monuments. Hitler, who had once aspired to be an artist, became animated when he found someone who understood his vision. "He talked to me as one artist to another," Speer would later reflect. "He was full of ideas, full of vision." That meeting forged an instant connection, and from that point on, Hitler would refer to Speer as mein Architekt, which of course translates to my architect. Eager to maintain this special connection, Speer would do anything to make sure that Hitler was happy. In 1933, after Hitler had become Chancellor of Germany, he had plans to hold a massive rally in Berlin to showcase the strength and unity of the new regime. He assigned Albert Speer the task of designing the event. Despite having limited resources and a tight deadline, Speer compensated by using his imagination. At the old Berlin Sportpalast, he arranged 130 anti-aircraft searchlights all around the arena, pointing straight up into the night sky. When activated, they formed towering columns of white light, creating a glowing cage of radiance that stretched into the clouds. From the ground, it resembled a cathedral made not of stone but of light itself. People were awestruck, and the stunning spectacle became one of the most iconic images of Nazi propaganda, representing power, unity, and eternity. Speer later recalled, quote, "It was as if we stood inside a vault of heaven, and the Führer was at its center." Hitler was captivated by it, and that single moment propelled Speer to stardom within the regime. Following this success, invitations began to pour in for Speer to design more rallies, party headquarters, and parade grounds. He met with Hitler regularly at the Chancellery, or at the Führer's private home in Bavaria. Their conversations ranged from politics to art, architecture to destiny. Hitler admired Speer's calmness and efficiency, while Speer admired Hitler's certainty. During dinners, Hitler would sketch his vision for a grand new Germany, filled with towering domes, vast squares, and wide boulevards that would render the old world small by comparison. Speer would take these sketches home, refine them, and then return them with detailed plans, transforming Hitler's fantasies into realized blueprints. The following year, Speer's skills were tested on a scale few architects ever encounter. The Nazi Party's annual rally in Nuremberg was set to be filmed by Leni Riefenstahl for a major propaganda film titled Triumph of the Will. Speer designed the entire site, featuring massive stone stands, precise rows of flags, and the grand central podium where Hitler would address hundreds of thousands of followers. He meticulously planned every detail, how the light would illuminate the flags at sunset, the placement of the cameras, and the synchronized marching of soldiers across the field. This entire project was not just about architecture, it was about psychology, and the effect that Speer had created was hypnotic. The audience appeared endless and perfectly arranged, bound together by their endless devotion. Speer had crafted the visual language of dictatorship, and through Riefenstahl's camera lens, that imagery was spread across the world. In private, Hitler told Speer that he was the only one who understood his vision, and referred to him as a genius. Thus, Speer began to see himself as more than just an architect. He was constructing not merely buildings, but symbols. He later wrote, quote, "Each building was meant to show the greatness of our movement and the eternity of the Reich." However, behind this sense of purpose, something darker was emerging. The beauty and perfection of the architecture was part of a deception. It was not designed to uplift the people. It was intended to control them. By 1937, Speer had become the general building inspector for the Reich, one of the most powerful positions in Nazi Germany. He reported directly to Hitler, and together they began planning their most ambitious project yet, the rebirth of Berlin, envisioned as the capital of a new empire, termed Germania. Hitler wanted Berlin to become the heart of his empire, a city that could accommodate 10 million people, filled with marble palaces, monuments, and avenues wider than any existing on Earth. At its center would stand the Volkshalle, or People's Hall, capped by a dome so expansive it would dwarf St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Inside, 180,000 people could gather to hear the Führer speak. The construction of the city would occur in secret stages, prepared for completion after the anticipated victory in the war that Hitler was planning. In preparation, thousands of homes were demolished, families were forcibly relocated, and Jews were expelled from entire districts to make way for this new city of the master race. And Speer was the one who oversaw the entire process. He did not question or protest. He simply built and engineered. He would later admit, quote, "I became intoxicated with the scale of the work. My sense of responsibility disappeared." By the late 1930s, Albert Speer was no longer just an architect. He had become the designer of Hitler's dreams and the builder of his empire. However, it would not be long until his work would extend beyond marble and stone, and he would stop designing buildings and begin constructing weapons. The dream of Germania was put on hold. Hitler's armies had invaded Poland, and Europe was at war. For Albert Speer, this change was sudden, but not unwelcome. The grand buildings, the marble, the parade grounds, all of it could wait. For now, Hitler needed someone who could build for war, and Speer was ready. On February 8, 1942, an aircraft carrying Fritz Todt, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and Munitions, exploded on takeoff from the Führer's Eastern Front headquarters. There were no survivors. Todt had become one of the few men brave enough to tell Hitler the truth, that Germany couldn't win a long war against the combined might of Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States. Hours before his death, he informed his aides that continuing the war was pointless. Whether the crash was an accident or something more sinister remains unclear. However, within 24 hours, Hitler would personally appoint Albert Speer as his successor, the 36-year-old architect suddenly controlling Germany's entire war economy, and from the moment he took over, Speer would throw himself into the job. Factories were running at half capacity, resources were scarce, and bureaucracy had strangled production, and so Speer set about reorganizing everything. He simplified designs, cut waste, and centralized control under his ministry. He introduced strict timetables, efficiency charts, and a new focus on results rather than hierarchy. Even as Allied bombers were destroying German cities, production increased. More planes, more tanks, more ammunition. And between 1942 and 1944, armament output would triple. To Hitler it was a miracle, and he called Speer his savior. To others, he became known as the Nazi who got things done. But behind those numbers lies a brutal truth. To keep his factories running, Speer needed workers, millions of them, and with most German men fighting on the front, there were none left at home to work. The solution would come from Fritz Sauckel, the Nazi official in charge of labor. Sauckel would promise Speer an endless supply of workers from the occupied territories, men, women, and even children, who were rounded up and shipped to Germany in cattle cars. They came from Poland, from France, the Netherlands, and the Soviet Union. They arrived in chains, terrified, exhausted, and hungry. And by 1944, over 12 million foreign workers were laboring in Germany, many of them working directly under Speer's armament program, living in barbed wire camps where they were beaten if they slowed down and denied food, rest, and medicine. Thousands would die each month. Speer insists that he tried to improve their conditions, but documents and testimony from survivors tell a very different story. In 1943, his ministry began building underground factories to protect production from Allied bombing. One of the most infamous is Dora Mittelbau, hidden beneath the Harz Mountains. Here prisoners from the Buchenwald concentration camp were forced to build the new V2 rockets, Hitler's so-called vengeance weapons. The tunnels were dark, damp, and deadly. Workers slept on the ground, surrounded by corpses, and if they faltered, they were hanged in front of others. Tens of thousands would die from starvation, disease, or execution. Speer would visit Dora in late 1943. He walked through the tunnels, saw the bodies, the filth, and the dying men, and in response, he would raise the production targets. Later, at the Nuremberg trials, Speer would claim ignorance, asserting that he knew nothing of the Holocaust or the mass murders occurring in the camps. However, the evidence suggests otherwise. He attended meetings where the use of concentration camp labor was openly discussed. He received reports indicating, quote, shortages of human material, a phrase meaning that people were dying faster than they could be replaced, and he personally authorized contracts with the SS to supply slave workers for his factories. There is no doubt that he knew exactly what was happening. In his own words, written years later, Speer admitted, quote, "I now see that I should have known. My failure was not to ask what was happening." But this is misleading. He didn't fail to ask. He chose not to care. By 1944, the tide of war had turned. The Allies had landed in France, and the Red Army was advancing from the east. German cities were burning, yet Hitler still believed that victory was possible. Speer, on the other hand, worked tirelessly to keep the factories running. He created new production networks deep underground, ordered the rebuilding of bombed plants, and reorganized transport and fuel supplies. Even when logic suggested that the war was over, Speer continued to fight. Not with guns, but with clipboards and deadlines. In meetings, he told his colleagues that his duty was to, quote, keep the machine alive as long as possible. And so he did. The war dragged on month after month, largely because Albert Speer made sure that it could. As 1945 began, Germany was collapsing. Bombs fell on a daily basis. The railways were crippled, and millions were left homeless. Hitler retreated into a fantasy, convinced that these new wonder weapons would save the Reich. But Speer knew that it was over. In March, Hitler issued what became known as the Nero Decree, which ordered the destruction of everything useful to the enemy: bridges, factories, farms, and power stations. If Germany could not win, then it would not survive. For the first time, Speer hesitated. He visited city after city, quietly instructing officials to ignore the decree. He met with generals pleading for reason, and even contemplating assassinating Hitler. Later, he would claim this was his moral awakening, his attempt to save what was left of Germany. But his defiance was calculated, quiet, and it came too late. Millions were already dead. By April 1945, Hitler's empire had shrunk to a few city blocks in Berlin. In the Führer's bunker, the once close friendship between Hitler and Speer had finally broke down. Speer confessed that he had disobeyed the Führer's orders for destruction. Hitler listened in silence and simply replied, quote, "If this is true, you have betrayed me." They would never meet again. On May 8th, Germany surrendered. The war was over and Hitler was dead. The Reich he had built had turned to rubble. Albert Speer, the man who had once promised to build a world that would last 1,000 years, stepped out of the ashes and turned himself in to the Allies. Although he would not face a firing squad, but instead he would face a courtroom. With Germany lying in ruins, cities being flattened, railways twisted, and the Reich reduced to smoke and rubble, from the wreckage, Allied soldiers pull millions of documents, blueprints, orders and lists, the paper remnants of a dictatorship, and among them the signature of Albert Speer would appear repeatedly. Speer surrendered willingly in Hamburg. He walked into British custody wearing a plain suit, as polite as ever. There was no pistol, no cyanide pill, and no final stand. Just quiet obedience, as if he was reporting for another assignment. To many Allied officers, he did not fit the image of a Nazi. He spoke perfect English, shook hands, and thanked his guards. When asked about Hitler, he would sigh and reply, quote, "A tragedy for Germany." The performance had begun. In November 1945, the International Military Tribunal had opened in Nuremberg, the same city where Speer's searchlights once illuminated cathedrals in the sky. 22 surviving leaders of the Third Reich would sit in the dock: Göring, Hess, Ribbentrop, Keitel, and Speer. Reporters crowd the gallery and cameras roll as the world demanded answers. While others might have ranted or denied, Speer would behave differently. He sat upright, listened carefully, and spoke with calm precision. He admitted moral responsibility for the regime and expressed his feelings of shame and claimed that he did not know about the extermination camps. It shocked many who were watching. This was a Nazi who was saying sorry. It was simply unheard of. He would go on to say, quote, "I was in a position of responsibility. Because of that, I must share in the guilt." He pauses before adding, almost gently, "Whether I knew of the crimes in detail or not, I knew that something terrible was happening." His words resonating throughout the courtroom. Historians would later call it the most intelligent defense ever made at Nuremberg. By admitting some guilt, Speer distances himself from the worst of the crimes, presenting himself not as a monster, but as a man who had lost his way. And it seemed to work. While Göring, Ribbentrop, and others are sentenced to hang, Speer receives a 20-year sentence in Spandau prison. The judges describe him as, quote, "an educated man who should have known better." After being sentenced, he bows slightly, thanks the court, and is led away, with the world beginning to see him not as the builder of a dictatorship, but as its repentant survivor. Spandau prison was demolished in 1987 after the death of its last inmate, Rudolf Hess, the site being cleared to prevent it from becoming a neo-Nazi shrine. It was once a heavy fortress of stone and silence. Only 7 prisoners were held there at once, with Speer being among them. His daily routine was strict. He swept floors, tended a small garden, and chopped firewood. He would count the bricks of the walls around him, and for exercise he would walk in circles, exactly 10,000 paces a day, a habit that became an obsession. During the night, using tiny scraps of paper smuggled by the guards, he would write, keeping detailed diaries filled with memories, thoughts, and reflections on the past. He would describe Hitler as both charismatic and destructive, while seeing himself as naive, ambitious, and blind. Quote, "I joined the party because of its appeal to order," he writes. "I stayed because I wanted to build. I failed to see that I was building for a devil." While the tone is calm, thoughtful, and regretful, even in his remorse, Speer edits his narrative. He removes the orders he signed, the meetings he attended, and the photographs showing him standing at the edge of mass graves. He crafted his own story just like one of his building plans. In 1966, Speer completed his sentence, and he walked free through the gates of Spandau, thin and grey-haired, carrying only a suitcase and hundreds of pages of notes. Outside, he was swarmed by reporters, flashbulbs popping, one reporter shouting, quote, "Herr Speer, do you still feel guilty?" He then answers softly, "How could anyone not?" Overnight, he became a sensation. His first book, Inside the Third Reich, was published in 1969. It reads like a confession, intelligent, emotional, and almost poetic. Speer portrays himself as the loyal technocrat who fell under Hitler's spell, and later recognized the truth, but all too late. Readers were captivated, and for many, it is the first time that a senior Nazi speaks like a human rather than a fanatic. Television hosts would invite him on air, with journalists describing him as, quote, "the only decent man among them." He would appear in documentaries, elegant and articulate, warning the next generation about, quote, "the dangers of blind obedience." For a world exhausted by monsters, Speer's civility was comforting. He became a symbol of proof that redemption was possible. For 20 years, Albert Speer sold a narrative that the world wanted to believe, that there could be such a thing as a good Nazi. He portrayed himself as a man who served Hitler, but who did not share in his hatred, a man who was part of evil, yet somehow stood apart from it. But redemption built on lies simply cannot last. In the 1970s and 80s, historians began to dig through archives and uncover meeting minutes, memos, and letters that Speer never mentioned. They find his signature on requests for concentration camp labor, budgets for gas mask filters supplied to Auschwitz, and construction orders for factories run by the SS. In a memo from 1943, Speer writes that more workers must be, quote, "secured from the camps." In another, he discusses visiting Mauthausen, one of the deadliest camps in Austria. The image of the innocent technocrat was beginning to crumble. Even his prison diaries show signs of calculation. Researchers discover that he edited them after the fact, removing pages that linked him directly to forced labor programs. What he called honesty was, in fact, self-design, the final project of an architect who could not stop building, even when the structure was himself. On September 1st, 1981, While in London for a television interview, Albert Speer passed away quietly in his hotel room at the age of 67. There was no trial, no confession, and no reckoning. Just the body carried out under a sheet, along with a stack of manuscripts which he left behind. In the years that followed, historians worked to piece together the truth. Speer had been aware of the Holocaust. While he might not have known every detail, he certainly knew enough. He had attended the Posen Conference, where Himmler openly discussed, quote, the extermination of the Jews, and he had visited the camps that supplied his ministry. In the end, the idea of the good Nazi was a myth. There was only a clever man who understood what people wanted to hear. Speer's life offers an uncomfortable lesson. Great crimes do not always require great monsters. They can be carried out by clever, disciplined, normal people. Speer exemplified what psychologists would later term the banality of evil. He did not harbor hatred, he simply obeyed. He did not commit murder himself, but he enabled it, and in doing so he made mass murder possible. Speer made all the effort to not appear like a monster on the surface, but nonetheless a monster below still remained, wearing the skin of a good Nazi.